Steffi, would you please lend me your backpack? My school bag is too small to put all the things for the trip in it, and Timmy won't let me take his bag. Sure, you're welcome, Evie. It's on the bottom shelf in the wardrobe. I would like to go with you, but for the exams. Why is Timmy's junk lying here? Do you let him play in your room? You know, Evie, no one wants him around when he plays on, but he has to play somewhere. I don't mind as long as Timmy tidies up after himself, which he doesn't do, of course. Here is the backpack. Oh, what's that, Steffi? An old-fashioned jacket? Is it some kind of uniform? It's a seaman's coat. My great-grandmother Cindy gave it to me when I asked her how she came to know my great-grandfather Paul. I promised to keep it ever since. And it was many years ago, when I was even younger than you. Steffi, do tell me. I like love stories so much. But this is no ordinary love story. It began more like a drama. Cindy and her baby sister Amy were the daughters of a well-to-do port official in Southampton. In 1912, their father died suddenly, and their mother Susie, being American, decided to go back to her family in New York. You mean my great-grandaunt Cindy was born in the UK? Yes, but she grew up in America anyway, because when her family left for New York, she was only 6. Amy was 9 months old. They had a lot of luggage besides. So Uncle Mike, Susie's younger brother, came from New York to help with the crossing. And the tragic part of the story is that the ship they boarded was the Titanic. My word, but they did survive the sinking. I mean, Uncle Mike too. He joined the Navy and fought in both world wars. So he did, though in 1912 he was an 18-year-old boy and had just begun to study medicine. I have never seen him, of course. He lived until 1978, and saw the time when Cindy and Amy were grown women, with families and children of their own. But Cindy remembered him very well. He turned all 4 days of their fateful journey in a bright and pleasant dream. She recalled sunny hours they spent on a promenade deck, the games they played and friends they made. So when late at night Uncle Mike put her into a life jacket and carried her out of the cabin, she thought it was just some new game. And all of them were placed in a lifeboat? That's exactly what they weren't. They were wealthy and traveled second class, but the evacuation of the passengers was so poorly organized that they only reached the boat deck at 1:30 in the morning. By that time it became clear that the ship was doomed, and the room in the boats wasn't enough for everyone. Anyway, Susie realized this only when Mike pushed his way to the lifeboat and excitedly asked if there was room for his sister and 2 children. An officer who was in charge there ordered Susie into the boat, but she refused to go. Susie became hysterical. She screamed that she would not live without her brother. In addition, the ship tilted heavily, and a large gap formed between the side of the Titanic and the lifeboat. Uncle Mike was desperate to save his sister, and decided to make her understand that she simply had to leave. So he threw Cindy into the boat. But Jamie was too small to be thrown this way. While Mike was thinking what to do, the officer took off his coat, wrapped the baby in it, and handed it over safely. When Susie was already in the boat, she tried to pass the coat back, but the officer shouted to her to keep it, because the night was cold. And what about Uncle Mike? Well, he told Susie afterwards that he had no intention to abandon ship so as to try and save himself. Uncle Mike wasn't much of a sportsman and couldn't swim at all, but he was realistic enough to understand that in spite of a life jacket, he would only last a couple of minutes in the freezing water. He stood on the upper deck, which began to flood. The very last boat that they succeeded to launch, a collapsible one, was being lowered before his eyes. The boat still had vacant seats. Suddenly, the same officer ran into Mike and recognized him. That wonderful sailor evidently took pity of Mike because, leaning over the rails, he cried to the man in command of the boat, "Bright, Bright, watch for the boy!" Then he put Mike behind the rails and told him, "Now jump for your life." Although Mike did fall in the water, he was pulled aboard almost immediately by the people who were in the boat. The last thing Mike remembered was the face of the officer looking down from the deck to make sure he was safe. Uncle Mike described it thus: "This was the first time I've met so much sympathy in a stranger. I committed his face to my memory as if I had photographed it. When I feel sad or offended or lonely, I remember this face of an enthusiast, brave and good-natured at the same time, the face of a man who wanted to make the world a better place. When I think that my work is hard or my life is complicated, I recall this living image of a guardian angel who did what he could, and even more than he should, to perform his duty efficiently, despite the ordeal. Unfortunately, the gallant officer lost his life that night. According to those few survivors who stayed on board the Titanic to the last, he was washed off the deck when they tried to launch the two remaining boats. Uncle Mike suffered greatly from cold, but he received no lifetime injuries. It happened so that the boat he was in returned to search for the survivors, and some people were transferred into another one, the one which Susie and the girls chanced aboard. Susie covered her brother with the officer's coat, and it kept him warmer. "Well, Steffi, it's just amazing. But you haven't told me yet who Paul was." "You see, Evie, both Uncle Mike and Susie wanted to show their gratitude to the officer. His papers were in the code, so having failed to find his name in the survivors list, they understood that he didn't make it. When they recovered from the first shock, Mike returned to Southampton looking for his savior's family. It turned out that the officer was not married, but since his parents had already died, he lived with an older sister, who also took care of a younger brother, the baby of the family, a 10-year-old boy named Paul. Mike took the boy under his wing. When the war broke out and Mike joined the Navy as a ship's doctor, he continued to look after Paul's welfare. A few years later, Susie invited Paul to spend Christmas with them in New York. There he met and married my great-grandmother Cindy and settled in America for good. Paul worked as a lawyer and had nothing to do with the sea, but it was his privilege to keep his brother's coat, which remained in the family as a precious relic. And now this rare privilege belongs to me.